So we're going to have a conversation for 1.5 hours, or around an hour, perhaps. How much time do we have? An hour and a half. So I did get it right. And we're going to be talking about Peder Balke. He's a Norwegian artist who was very active in the 19th century. So he produced a number of works which have been put together in an exhibition called Sauvages nudités. And this opened today at the castle in Fontainebleau, in the apartment. So in order to see this exhibition, you have to go into the chateau. And once you have bought your ticket for the chateau, you can also have access to this exhibition. And these artists who worked in the northern region of Europe. So I'm not really going to go into the exhibition. We'll see if there are any questions on that afterwards. So it's an exhibition which was prepared by the National Institute for Art History with the chateau in Fontainebleau and with the Nordic Institute. And the director is with us, Nordagut, and he has been good enough to come and participate in this conversation. Balke was somebody who was little known in France, and despite that, he was, however, collected by the King Louis Philippe in France, and his works also are in the Louvre. But people don't tend to go into that particular room because at the very end of the journey, a bit difficult to find, in fact, at the Louvre. So the idea of the exhibition is to highlight his work. Now, when I thought about what to talk about, quite naturally, and by discussing with Knut, we had the idea to invite Christos Le Ribot, because he is a French art historian, and he, in fact, is director of the Art Institute, and he has a lot of knowledge of the 19th century Nordic painters. And he also has various projects for his museum on Danish paintings, and he will be speaking in another roundtable. So we thought that we could have this discussion about Peder Balke. And since this is somebody who is little known, perhaps we can start, or perhaps Mr. Knut could start by talking about who this artist is. Talking about the beginning of his career, the way in which he worked.
Was a Norwegian artist from the Romantic period. He was born in rather poor circumstances. I mean, how much biography should we go into?
Go into any you want.
I think.
Don't take the whole 1 hour and a half.
Well, I thought perhaps I could, I could just read aloud from the little book here. No. And you too, exactly. No. But I like to comment, before I start talking more about, we start to talk more about Peder Balke, I like to comment on, do I do something wrong? Okay. Okay. Normally people can hear me without the microphone, but here we are. Because you are in the glass cage, yes. You mentioned the paintings in the Louvre, Eric, and that people don't go there. Well, I tried to go there yesterday, and I couldn't because it was closed. And last time I was in Paris, I tried to go there too, and then it was also closed. So I think it's a good idea that you at least have 2 of them here in Fontainebleau instead, where people can actually see them. So thank you for that. And I think I'd like to thank you, Eric, and the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art, and also the Château de Fontainebleau, for organizing both the festival and the exhibition, because I think this will bring more focus on Nordic art history in general, and on Peder Balke in particular. And with experience from Louvre yesterday, that is definitely needed here in France, as in the rest of the world. Balke, his destiny is in a way a symbol of the young, small nation of Norway. He was born in 1804 in the countryside, very poor background, son of peasants. He came into a big farm as a young man, as a helping hand. Then he was an apprentice with a painter. Not a fine artist painter, you see, but a craftsman's painter who would decorate the churches and the big houses of the farms. But Norwegian farmers at that time were quite enlightened, and they had some money. They put together their money so this young man could have an education. They saw his talent, and they sent him to the capital of Oslo, where he attended a drawing school. Later, he went to Stockholm, where he was a student of the famous Professor Carl Johan Falkrans, who I'm sure that my Swedish colleagues will talk more about later today or during the weekend. And eventually he went to Dresden, where he was a pupil of the really important Norwegian painter of the day, Johan Christian Dahl, and he also met with Caspar David Friedrich, whose works you will see became quite important to him. But very important to Balke was also his travels. He was an artist who traveled all the time. And his first important journey was to northern Norway in 1832. And here we are at North Cape. This is a painting from 1845. We have very few of his sketches from the northern journey survives. Most of it were probably painted by memory. So it's not about topography, it's about the impression that this dramatic landscape made on him, as you can see here. And I'm sure you agree when I talk about the romantic influence from Caspar David Friedrich and others are present. He, of course, also, here we have Friedrich. Yes, this is the impression of the North. This is something we will hear more about from some of our French colleagues later today, the French expedition to the North. But these were, of course, things that happened parallel to Balke. What is interesting with Balke, I think, is not just his travels, his images of the North, it's the way he did it. And I think we need to move on with the PowerPoint. This is some of the images. Yes.
But you want?
I don't know what I want, really, because I don't remember the chronology of these pictures. I think what is interesting is when he started, to paint in the 50s. In the late 1840s, he had a big commission for the King of the French, Louis Philippe. I think Eric might want to talk more about that. But this is at the stage he developed a very particular technique, where he added white. He had a white grounding, and then he added very thin paint, which he drew. He drew it away. So rather than adding, he reducted. And this is a technique based on his experience as a craftsman, but which he also used to create the atmosphere, the dramatic waves. And this turns more and more into an experiment with technique that in some of the late paintings that you will see in the exhibition are, with our modern eyes, close to abstraction.
Peut-être qu'on peut rajouter dans si on fait ce rapide parcours.
Now, if we go, so we had a very quick overview of his career, but in fact, the works that were commissioned in 1840s, there was an order that came from Louis Philippe, and I think we're going to talk about this with Christophe. But then he wanted to be a painter who was well-renowned, and so this meant that he went to Great Britain, to Germany and other places, and we'll go back to that in a moment. But Balke returned to Norway, wasn't as successful as he hoped, but it's an artist whose career officially stopped at that point. And this is not all that frequent if you look at this in a bit more detail. But his latest productions, or later productions, 1860s to 1870s, which where we have large works, but also some very small works on wood, and you can see a selection of these in the exhibition in Fontainebleau. But this work was not destined for the general public. So it was, there were works that, and we don't really know how they were produced, but we don't really know who they are for either. And or who they were passed for. So at this particular time, Balke And perhaps this is better that Mr. Knut tells you this rather than I do. So Balke withdraws from the world of art, and what does he do at that point?
Well, the thing is, he had another career as well. He was also something of a businessman. He had his own business for a period. But he was also a politician or a social reformer, which is another reason why he was rather unpopular with parts of the establishment. He was a socialist. He joined the early labor movement in Norway. And actually, when he had earned money on his own, he came from a very poor background, but he earned himself a small fortune as a businessman. He built a part of the city with housing for workmen and their families. This was a great social project in its time, more or less forgotten today. And with that, these laborers, these working men, they also got a permanent address, so they were suddenly allowed to vote. And that made the political landscape switch, because they voted, of course, for the left wing. And at one point, this part of the city burnt down. We don't know how, we can only guess what happened with his unpopularity. But of course, he went bankrupt on this. He had a heart attack, and in his late years, in the 1870s, 80s, this sick, disillusioned man, he sat in his studio and painted these things. And we have this theory that these small paintings, they are, as Erik points out, some of them are smaller than this, they're like a postcard, that they were painted on building material from the houses that burnt down. So it's a sort of recycling of a social idea turned into art. And this explains at least partly why he was on the margins of established art life at that time, because he concentrated on something different, and he was not taken seriously as an artist. I mean, he was taken seriously by the King of the French, and also the royal family of Sweden and Norway purchased his pictures. But the Norwegian art circles of the time, they were quite small. This was like a pond, and he was criticized heavily. So around 1850, he stopped exhibiting and concentrated on other things instead. And when he died in 1887, strangely enough, in the obituaries, he's praised for his social reform. He's remembered as a businessman. Not a word is mentioned about him as an artist.
Alors, nous reparlerons de l'art.
So we'll talk about the rediscovery of Balke. And I'd like to hand over to Christophe Le Ribot now. And we're going to try and have a free sort of discussion, so there's no particular structure to it. So I can see that Christophe is rather surprised by this. So just to have a point of view which is which comes from the outside on Balke. So what can an art historian for the 19th century, who has a lot of knowledge about European painting of that particular period, but also knows a lot about French art history of the same period. So what can we do with somebody like Balke? Where can we put him? Where can we position this person? Where we can position him in art history, European art history, that is. So apart from French art history of the period, well, Balke is somebody rather strange, so somebody very different from what's considered normal at the time. So in terms of the exhibitions that we've been organizing at the Petit Palais, we looked at a lot of foreign artists that we didn't have in our collections, but at some point he came to France. He felt that he had to go to the École des Beaux-Arts in France to complete his education. That was the case of Edelfelt, who we will also be exhibiting over the coming years. It was an artist. He was an artist from the north, And they came to France for notoriety. They stayed a long time. Anders Zorn, for example, spent about 10 years in France. So they had very rich exchanges with other artists and managed to create their own niche. Carl Larsen, the same thing for him. He was somebody who spent a lot of time in France, at Grès-sur-Loing, and that will be the subject of another roundtable. I think that's on Sunday. So Balke, well, we have artists that we can compare with other artists. We can compare, for example, Zorn, Alpa Bénard, or the works by Dussorla, Sargent, that were also shown in Paris Larsen as well. So there was a whole tradition then, and that he was able to see, and he came up with something rather original. Now, in terms of Balke, this is quite different. The situation was quite different. So his work was quite modern, but also this was perhaps due to his rather unusual career. He was grew up in a poor background and became a great painter and sculptor. So that's something which is we see all the time in terms of art history. But he was somebody who came from a country where there wasn't really an artistic tradition, not in the Western sense anyway, not a strong artistic tradition. So there was no real professional teaching of art and painting at the time. So there were some galleries in the 1820s. There weren't many collectors at the time. So very few opportunities then for a young artist, somebody who wanted to paint. So this is why he started painting and decorating buildings. So Mr. Knut has, I'm sure, will contradict me what I say, but that was off mic. So at the end of the day, this person, he educated himself, but it was rather difficult. There were no museums. There were not many Norwegian artists about at the time. But he's somebody who was friends with everybody, easy to get along with, and he was able to convince people to help him, to fund him. And so he was able to create his own career. And this career, which was, however, quite brief for various reasons, for political reasons, but and also there was no major art market in Norway. He turned his hand to something else. And so his life was rather eccentric, let's say, or out of the ordinary. So it's difficult to include him in the panorama of these landscape painters of the 19th century, where he would nevertheless have his rightful place. So he tended to paint the sea, the northern Cape. He hasn't really produced a huge quantity of picturesque works of villages and landscapes, not like Finlay, for example, who paint the waterfalls and other very picturesque aspects of these countries. And also, these paintings are much more sought after by the collectors, French collectors, German collectors, apart from the time with Louis Philippe, which we'll talk about a bit later on. I think you want to react to that.
I wanted to react to something else you said first, because you said he turned to painting houses because there wasn't an art market. That's not correct. He started as an apprentice before he had discovered there was something as art at all. Remember, this was a poor young man growing up in the countryside of Norway. He hadn't access to what you would call an artistic tradition here in France, the academies, etc. But as soon as he discovered it, he didn't abandon craftsmanship because he was always a craftsman, but he turned away to more what we would call fine art. So it started there because of, as a profession, in the countryside. Then he became an artist. So but you're quite right when you say that he was self-taught. He created his own career, and there was, of course, one great, well-known artist in Northern Europe at the time, and that was Johan Christian Dahl, who was very important to not only all Norwegian artists of the time, but also many Scandinavians and even Northern European artists who came to Dresden to study with him or just to get a helping hand. He was a somebody in European art. He was professor in academy. He was the best friend of Caspar David Friedrich. He could provide young Norwegians or Scandinavians with introductions to important collections. So it's natural that Balke sought out his acquaintance, as other artists like Thomas Fearnley did, Knut Bode, another Norwegian romantic. And the reason why he stopped exhibiting, I don't think it just has to do with the market, because there wasn't a big market. There was a National Gallery which was established in 1837. It didn't have a building of its own then, but it did show in various spaces. And actually it was in the Kunstverein, Société de l'Art in Oslo, that the first time he saw that Balke saw a painting by Dahl, which was a Danish landscape, and that was the one thing that impressed him so much he decided to become a landscape painter. This is something he writes about in his memoirs. But the reason why he stopped being a professional, well, he didn't stop being an artist, did he? Because he continued to paint. And what is an artist? I mean, he continued to be an artist, but for his own sake. But the reason he stopped exhibiting was, I think, many things. It was the reactions, the criticism. He didn't fit into the art ideals of the time. After Dresden, Norwegian artists started to go to Düsseldorf, which was much more, shall we say, Biedermeier, more bourgeois in taste, little idyllic scenes, like you say, he didn't paint. So yeah, so he wasn't suited for the market that grew up at that time. So that's the point.
Peut-être qu'on peut rajouter.
So perhaps we can say that we can mention something which is important for the French public. Norvège was part of the Swedish kingdom at the time.
Oui.
It was a forced union, but still a union. It was not a part, not a colony.
Non.
No, I know that when I said that it would be controversial, because if I talk about an association, that might give the impression that it was voluntary, but no, it was the result of the Napoleonic Wars, which meant that there was also an association with Denmark, and that was replaced by something which people really didn't want, by an association with Sweden, and even though the politicians in Norwegian had understood that there was no other choice, but so there was not much resistance to this association. But anyway, what I'm getting at is that, and you can see this in a number of the reproductions that have been shown, for a Norwegian artist at the time, it was quite normal to travel outside Norway and to go and look for the patronage of the king, the Swedish king, that is, to go to Stockholm then. And I can't find the place, but so here we have a vision of Stockholm, and the paintings are ordered by Louis Philippe. There are some views which are not just views of Norway. So there's a national context, and so all the artists that we've just mentioned, those are artists who at some point leave Norway in order to go and be trained elsewhere, and also to find a wider market, either with collectors, court collectors, royal collectors in Stockholm, or in other cities in Sweden, or in Germany, in the different German states, but in the case of Balke, he came to France, and also some of them went to England. Now let me go back to what Christoph said. Now in terms of his contemporaries, who tended at some point to produce the same type of scene, so was this to find the buyers, the right people to buy these type of paintings? But so these picturesque landscapes, well, led to very different, diverse paintings. But Balke, as far as we know, in terms of his work, or as far as I know, Balke very quickly reduced his repertoire. So if we go back to what Christophe said, i.e., at some point we find views of waterfalls, mountains, but very quickly, and this is my opinion, but perhaps Mr. Knut won't agree with that, but from 1840 onwards, his repertoire, and I'm looking for a word which isn't negative here, which doesn't have a negative connotation, but he doesn't want his work to be stereotyped. So he had a type of iconography which basically just meant that he painted a few subjects. So he did something which is not very frequent or common in this particular era. So he didn't repeatedly paint the same thing, the same subjects. And he did something which was quite obsessive as well. And in fact, he is an obsessive artist. He's somebody which isn't a marginal artist. There are other figures in Norwegian art history of artists who are also marginalized, but this wasn't his case. He was part of this system, but he was somebody whose technique didn't correspond and didn't want to be part or do what an organized art scene wanted him to do.
And maybe he was disappointed for the bad criticisms that he got, but even before he got these critics that said that he didn't hang his paintings well, that he was too symmetric. But anyway, he had this way of being obsessed by a few topics or combinations of topic which were repeated on and on with transformations that may seem too tiny from the outlook, but and I will be anachronic. When Mondrian invents neoplasticism around 1920, he only makes paintings with the three primary colors, with black lines and white or gray backgrounds. But in Balke, so of course it is repetitive as well, but in Balke, since the 1840s, he keeps repeating this, and it is not well received. And we see some relationship with some masters he've picked, some who are very famous from German painting, one who is a fully German artist, Friedrich, another one who is actually a Norwegian artist but living in Germany, Dahl, and whose career is largely a German career. And for Germany, it's meaningful, but for this period, it's a bit more complicated. So I invited Knut to answer and disagree with me. So I hope you will disagree with me.
With Friedrich is very interesting, because when you speak about Balke repeating himself, the same motif time after time, very often isolated, like, Cap Noir. This is perhaps one of his favorite subjects. I think this is sort of the leitmotif in his art, and we find it all the. Do we have more? Do we have more of them? Yeah, that's Stockholm.
I don't know what you put in.
No, neither do I. But I also like to return to another question. Well, you also mentioned that that Norwegian artists of the time had to travel. To not only to find patrons and collectors, but also to get an education, because Norway didn't have an art academy until 1909. But the fact that Balke chose Stockholm is quite unusual. because most artists, Norwegian artists, they continued to go to Copenhagen. Even if we had separated from Copenhagen in 1814, many Norwegians continued to regard Copenhagen as their cultural capital. I'm sorry to say this to my Swedish colleagues here, but that's how it was. People were very angry about the forced union with Sweden, so only very few artists went to Stockholm to study. They preferred to go to Copenhagen, and then very often they went on to different places in Germany, Dresden, and later Düsseldorf, etc. And if I can also say something about this, we talked about Balke as a social reformer. And when the scientific director of the festival entered the room, Verle, I thought about a very interesting lecture we had with Dan Wu earlier today, who is also an artist who is very socially committed, but whose artworks is as much a social project as a visual project. And in that sense, I think also we shouldn't separate Balke as we say he's stopped being an artist, did he? His social project, building a part of the city for workmen, that was a part of his life project as his paintings were. And if you can find some of the... Okay. And his social commitment is also reflected in his paintings. I mean, for us, this is romantic, dramatic, remote in the far north. But actually, it's also about the modern world, the dangers of modern shipfaring. For instance, this is Vardøhus fortress, very important point of defense close to the border of Russia. But here, he has switched it with a lighthouse. But there wasn't built a lighthouse at that part of the border until the 1890s, when Balke was dead. So why did he put it in? Well, among the many causes he committed to was the welfare of sailors. And he, of course, Norway was a shipping nation, and Norway grew as a shipping nation during the 19th century. But it was very dangerous. A lot of sailors died at sea. So Balke agitated towards the Norwegian parliament to build more lighthouses. So this can also be seen as a subtle political message. Again, a part of his social reform in the painting.
Tu veux dire quelque chose? Peut-être que je me permets de continuer.
I'd like to continue on this question of social reform. One of the motives that is strongly worked on, and I'm under the impression that not before the year 1860s, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm talking about the sailboat motor or with no motor. And this was in small paintings, but not only. When we start, as I did, getting interested in this, the fact that this motif is repeated on and on, sometimes we see a calm sea, sometimes a more agitated one, and we see landscape paintings that seem that they talk about anything else, but in the back of the painting we see some boat, whether it's a sailboat or an engine boat. And we have two more examples here. One is in the exhibit, the other one isn't. But we could multiply these examples. There's tens of paintings with a sailboat and a steamboat, whether it's a central theme of the painting or not. Of course, as an art historian, but not a specialist of the Norwegian painting, when we see a sailboat and a steamboat, we think of this great painting, which is the manifesto of industrialization and the defeat of the sailboat marine. It's Le Téméraire, taken to his last harbor to be destroyed, and this is a painting by Turner. So some people wrote on Balke who were not Norwegian, but we are not that many. And for me, I only wrote a few texts, but most scholars who wrote about Balke, they don't pay attention to the fact that Turner may have been important for Balke. Of course, we should do some research about it, but I do feel that this motif only happens after only in the 1850s. So after Balke went to London, and probably he saw this painting by Turner, which is in his workshop. Actually, we have many witnesses of this painting in London. So he makes something different. He takes, to my viewpoint, he takes this idea of the fight between modernity and the past, but what we see is actually in no painting do we see a victory of one on the other. And to me, this is a political statement and a social statement. Maybe I'm over-interpreting here, but I'd like to propose it, and of course we may discuss it, because what we see is the fight of man against nature, but with nature also, by means of modernity, but also by means of tradition. And when we see Balke does in the part of the city that he built, which is called Balkebuhl, the Balke town or village, he's not only interested in workers from the new industry, he also invites craftsmen, sailors, people who represent a way which is rooted in tradition. And also, maybe we should try and look into depth into this idea of a strong nationalism, which states that we should look into the actual resources of the Norwegian people and the humble Norwegians, like the sailors, the means to survive within this new context. And in the end, and maybe it has to do with something that is of a country which doesn't have a mild climate, that in the end nature wins over. Nature rips the sails of the sailboat and it stops men from sailing, etc. So there's a sentence in the Balke journal. I'm looking for it. There's one sentence that says, very straightforwardly, of course I can't find it now. I'm sorry, you're going to have to trust me. I'm sure that there's a sentence in this journal that insists on the fact that nature always wins over. I'm sure I'll find it. Yes, here it is. About his trip of 1832 in these northern regions, the beauty of nature has the main character, and humans who are nature's children only have a second part. So, of course, this is this idea that humans are secondary to nature. And in this case, and I totally agree with you as on many points, because you, Knut, know the topic much better than I do. But it seems to me that there's a romantic idea there, but there's also something that overwhelms him in the embodiment of social and political thought. And we also find it in the technical ways used. This reuse for fine arts of techniques that are used only for decorative paintings. You know, these tricks that one uses to decorate a room in a hotel or something of the type, which goes faster but which may not so much be for fine arts.
About nature, and the danger of nature, and of course Norway, with the history it had, the sea had always been important. Think about the Vikings that visited these shores a few generations ago, but also for shipping, trade, exploring, and also, of course, the fishing industry. And as mentioned, a lot of these people, they died in their meeting with nature. But it is also, as Eric points out, we see modernity sneaks in, both with the lighthouses and also with the steam engines, the boats that run on steam engines. Would you like to say something on that, Christophe? No? You don't want to say anything today?
On va forcer Christophe à prendre la parole alors. Peut-être.
Okay, let's force Christophe to take the floor. I'm going to take the floor in a very straightforward way. Balke travels to the North Cape in 1832. He never went back there. He just went there once. And we have few remains of that travel of 1832. Here's a drawing from the north of Norway. So he probably has one or several books with sketches of what he saw, and this will fuel the rest of his life. And from then, we see many byproducts or by works. And of course, as Knut said, when he went there, this was quite a tough journey. He had to take a boat that took considerable risks, even in summer, because of all the storms there. And then he reached the North Cape. In the North Cape at the time, he didn't go at the moment where he could see boreal aurora borealis, and I don't know that maybe he comments, he makes comments of it in his journal, but whether he saw aurora boreals or not, as on this oil paint, and you've seen more in the slides, he paints something abstract. As Knut said, this is a white painting covered by the black paint, and then he scraps. He takes a scraper, and for the aurora borealis, he just makes this effect of scrapping some stretches of the black paint over the white paint. And there's another painter, French painter, François-Auguste Billard, who travels to the same region around this time. He reaches the North Cape by land, and then by sea. And he joined a researchers group. Actually, as Christophe said earlier, there will be a roundtable on French and Romantic artists of that period. And with this expedition, he goes all the way to the Spielberg's Islands. It's a truly far away part from within the polar regions. He also brings back some sketches, etc. But when they became painting, he paints Magdalena Bay, and somehow it is as unrealistic as Balke's small paintings around these years. So I don't know how we can oblige you to take the floor from then. Well, artists that make their souvenirs of work is fructify is frequent, like Corot, who travels to Italy, and then he kept on painting about Italy in a recurrent way. It's also the case of Delacroix, who never painted while in Morocco. He made some hidden signs in 1832, but then he painted Morocco until the 1860s. 60s, and he's Morocco from 1835 or so, and his Morocco of 1850 and 60 is quite different. So he takes motifs and he feeds them with his own aesthetics research, and also from what he learned from that situation in this country around these years. So there's also a lot of topographists who are artists. They're actually invited by publishers to travel around France, Europe, Scotland, Normandy to draw or paint or make stampa, which was quite appreciated throughout Europe. And in Norway, the Great North was very inaccessible. It's quite early because we have very few views of even Brittany at the time, because Brittany is considered as a faraway region. There aren't that many roads, or at least comfortable roads. There aren't that many comfortable hotels until the year 1850 in Brittany. So the mere discovery of France is not, it doesn't go back so much in the past so it's more or less at Balke's time. So Balke tries to make this trip fructify. Even when he met Louis Philippe in exile after the revolution in 1795, he travels. It's hard to imagine Louis Philippe as a pre-romantic character, because we saw so many caricatures of him in the shape of a peer while he was old, and as a king who reached power quite late with quite moderate and bourgeois viewpoints. So it's hard for us to imagine such a young man who may have stayed in exile in a beautiful house around London, but on the contrary, he traveled. And what's surprising is that Balke decided to go to Paris, not as others, as I mentioned, to exhibit in Salon and Universal Fair for their art, because it's easier for him to become famous in such a city as Paris. But he has a more original idea. He goes to Paris to convince the king to buy from him or to order him views of sites that he had seen 40 years earlier. So we have quite accurate texts and letters that explain how he arrives to Paris with his wife and children. He tries to meet ambassadors and or other Norwegians in Paris who may tell him how to reach the king. And he's explained that he should write letters following the protocol, as Knut explains, and so that he can get in touch with Louis Philippe in the Tuileries. But in the end, he takes quite a courageous decision, which is probably a Norwegian decision, to write a more frank and direct letter to Louis Philippe, and it actually works. He was rewarded by being so audacious, and he meets Louis Philippe, who speaks a few Norwegian words. I think that they both speak in German, and they meet several times, and everybody's quite surprised. Of course, it's Louis Philippe who from 1847, so he's quite old, and he will not stay in power too long. He's actually isolated. It's a period where Many people turn their backs to him. There's a growing Republican opposition to him. So these are the last months of power before the revolution. So it's interesting to see that Balke proposes to him a series of sketches from the Great North and places that the king had visited in 1795, and he gets an order of big paintings that will actually not come to life because apart from two, because in the meantime there's the 1848 revolution, and in spite of it, Balke, even after the revolution, will try and insist on Louis Philippe to commit with his word, but Louis Philippe explains that, of course, he's in exile and almost dying, and therefore he's not really fit to order any painting that will honor his past memories of his trip to the Great North. Actually, Balke, but thanks to all these little paintings that stayed in Paris, Balke has quite some room in the Louvre. I mean, he's quite well represented in the Louvre, and maybe with more conventional works than the ones that we find more interested, not the ones of his Aurora Borealis. But from what I understood, once he's re-exhibited at the Louvre, the art historians were Norwegian art historians were quite shocked by the relevance of this artist, it seems. Will there be a controversy here?
No. I mean, we are now at the sort of the rediscovery of Balke when you start to talk about what has been written about him lately and the paintings rediscovered in Louvre. I think actually they were stored away in Versailles when one of my colleagues in the 1980s came to Paris and asked for them. And people said, no, we don't know who this artist is and where the paintings are, never seen them. But of course, just like Balke did, Norwegians don't give up, so we just came back and back and back until somebody dug them out from storage. But I think your description of Balke, if I could return to that for a moment, is correct. He was this kind of adventurous character who very easily got in contact with people. Not only Louis Philippe, I mean, he already as a student in Stockholm, he actually stayed with the Norwegian prime minister in Stockholm. Norway had two governments because of this union. And
Forced union.
But we had a constitution, thank you. And it was your Marshal de Bernadotte who forced us into the union, by the way, thank you. But he had friends on all levels from a very early stage. He was a person who befriended people, who built what we today would call a network, which of course was a great help in his career, in his travels, and he wasn't afraid to try. He even went to St. Petersburg, and he attempted to get a commission, but the court was out of town because it was the wrong season. He didn't know that, so he had to leave without a commission there. But I also think, you refer to Louis Philippe, the young Louis Philippe, as more romantic than you imagine. And I can actually confirm that impression, because I have an aunt who, as young, used to live up in the northernmost parts of Norway in Finnmark, because her husband was the district physician. And one day they visited a local family, and they saw on the shelves a portrait, an old print. And who is that? Oh, that's our great-great-great-grandfather. That's Louis Philippe. So there are people who claim they descend from Louis Philippe in the northernmost parts of Norway. So he must have been romantic on his journey. But you start also to talk about the rediscovery of Balke. And that really, should we... that's at the very end. Oops, what did I do now? That really begins, it begins here. Balke died in 1887, and as we mentioned earlier, completely forgotten as an artist, because he hadn't exhibited since around 1850. But that means he had been for almost 30 years sitting in his studio on his own, producing, we don't know how many numbers of little beautiful paintings. We call them sketches today, but they are not really sketches or studies. They are just what works on their own, I think, even if they have a sketch-like quality. And in 1914, Norway was celebrating the centennial of our independence and the Constitution.
1814, you would say independence?
No, 1914, yes, the Constitution. Yes, I would. We call it that. And then we had, of course, in 1905, we had separated from the Union with Sweden. So there was a lot to celebrate. So in 1914, it was a big exhibition. It was not an Exposition Universelle, though it had something of that character. And an entire part of the city was built on a field. It's in the middle of the city, but it was then on the outskirts of the city. And the commissioner for the art department, he wanted to. That was a Norwegian painter called Hans Ødegaard, and he wanted to show not only the established canon of Norwegian art history, Johan Christian Dahl and Fearnley were very famous. He wanted also to shed light on unknown artists. So several artists actually who had been unknown but who later re-entered art history was shown here, and that was Balke. It was also a couple of other painters like Lars Hertevik, and these artists had been what we can call outsiders in their time. Hertevik had been in a mental asylum most of his life. Balke was an outsider because of his poor background and his helter-skelter education. There were women artists who had been marginalized just because of that. And some of these artists were also published in a book by the then well-known critic Alf Herbitz, Recently Discovered Painters. And this also preceded an exhibition with an art dealer in Oslo, which came the year after with something like 100 works by Peder Balke. And then people started to think, what is this? What have we missed? And actually, the Swedes are very they bought the first paintings for the museum in Gothenburg, and also the art museum in Bergen bought something. And then the National Gallery was very hesitant because the director, he was very Francophile. He preferred the Impressionists and Edvard Munch, but he was forced to buy a few things. And then interestingly enough, he bought the late, very experimental things. And then also there were collectors who bought things. And then the next big exhibition was in the 1950s. There was another art historian who started to work on this, Henning Alsvik. All these names probably they don't mean anything to you, but I mention them anyway. And but still, it was only Norway. And in the 60s, the Danish artist Per Kirkeby, I think there will be a talk on Kirkeby during this festival. Yes, good. And Kirkeby, an expressionist painter, he saw his works and started to think. And many years later, around 1980, he published a book, which was also published in English. So that was probably the first international thing that was written about him. What is also interesting, you mentioned Turner, Eric. The earliest art historians who wrote about him, they said, oh, there is a similarity to Turner, there's a parallel. He must obviously have seen Turner. So it's only very late that Norwegian art historians start to deny this and say, no, he didn't see Turner. There are other artists who are much more important. And I think that has something to do with the fact that Norway as a young nation, the writing of art history became very national. One wouldn't like to admit to foreign influences. So he became this sort of self-made genius from the Norwegian countryside. And then we had, as late as which year was the exhibition in Copenhagen and in Krems? 2003 or something like that? No, 8? And then in 14 there was this exhibition in London. There was a focus exhibition in the Met in 2016. Now there is this beautiful exhibition here at Fontainebleau, thanks to Eric. And when will we see a bigger show in Paris? Yes, when will we see that? I look at Christophe.
Non, si on se connaît depuis quelques années.
Well, there is a project, in fact, a project for Paris for an exhibition, but the Petit Palais already organized a lot of exhibition on Nordic artists. But we have to kind of alternate with Italian artists and German artists and other things. So yes, but anyway, it is in the pipeline. It's coming up in the future. But the most memorable exhibition was the exhibition in London, Christopher Jopel. So I'd like to speak on his behalf. He couldn't be with us. It's a wonderful exhibition at the National Gallery in London, and this kind of woke everybody up. But the New York exhibition was perhaps a disappointing compared to the one in London. So perhaps you haven't seen it yet. But when you start your visit anyway, if you go into the normal entrance of the chateau, there's some stained glass, and this is where the exhibition is. So don't miss the little door that will take you to this exhibition. Otherwise, you'll end up wandering around the apartments, Napoleon's apartments. So really, it is worth seeing. And just a last point before we go to questions. As you've seen all these different paintings being scrolled down, I just want to talk about something. I just want to mention something. Yes, there was a commission from Louis Philippe. There was a proposal from Balke, so this was something very interesting. And Balke was in Paris for a couple of months. We don't really know exactly how long he stayed. He tried to meet with the king. But whether this was after the first discussion or before the first discussion, whether he produced something then. But in a very short space of time, anyway, he did produce 50 small works on cards, so sketches, if you like, so that he could present these to the king and sell them. And this is very interesting if we look at the rest of his career. So, in fact, he obeys the orders of the king. People have said he showed the king the view of the Northern Cape, which is a repetition of what Louis Philippe actually saw during one of his trips with his guides. And the king gets him to add another character that he'd forgotten to add, and that's his interpreter. I don't know whether it's a guide or an interpreter, but anyway, he gets him to add a different character. So if you look at the painting, and you can only do this if you're organizing an exhibition, so when it's flat on the table to see how it's painting, we do get the impression that something has been added. So it's a small character on the right-hand side of the painting, but you have to look very closely to see if this is a reproduction of the story or not. A second aspect, and I mention this because he's a very independent artist. In terms of his productive system, because at the time you had to depend on commissions, especially the commissions from a king. But so he had to obey kind of external principles. But Balke also accepted to do the king's bidding and add this character, even if it did change the composition of the work. So this kind of Balke is somebody who is very interesting to me as an art historian of the 20th century, and I look at the 19th century through the prism of the 20th century. So this is why I'm interested in Balke, because of these later works. Because I saw these later works, and I'm very interested in those because of this kind of obsessive character that I mentioned before. Their freedom, the freedom in terms of the materials that were used, and also the way in which Balke overcame some of the external principles. I don't know whether this is anachronism, but he did basically what he wanted to do. So a second point that I'd like to mention is that these paintings were in fact stored in the Louvre and other places for a very long time, in Dieppe, for example. And when they were found, I don't have the photos before they were restored, but when we found them in the 60s, this is what they looked like. So we had to know about the importance of Balke, and given what Mr. Knut has said, you have to have been to Norway, be Norwegian, to know that behind all this, this didn't look like very much, but there were some very remarkable works. So the view of the Northern Cape that you can see here, which the Louvre has accepted to lend us, this is a very good example of that. So we had to go through this very long restorations to have this very to get to the bottom of these paintings. So this exhibition will be open to the public at the Louvre. So rediscovery of Balke then, because we have these small paintings, these larger paintings from the 1850s and 60s, which made up most of the exhibition of the National Gallery in 2014, and also because they contain all these different aspects that we've mentioned. We talked about the sketches or studies of Balke. So if you take a painting like this, which isn't part of the exhibition, but which is nevertheless a very important work, and this shows us what I said, how we can create the effect of the aurora borealis simply by using this scraping technique with a scraper to produce these vertical lines. So you have the sea. You can see that the sea is basically produced by taking a comb or something like that, and so that they can create this effect of water. Of course, if you're a specialist of 20th century art and you see this kind of thing, what you think is using the type of material that Picasso used, or Braque. The fact that they used these painter and decorator methods so that they could really bring out a different aspect of beauty in their works. And the first time I thought about doing a Balke exhibition, I didn't go through with it. But I mention this because it's interesting that this is an artist who is very interesting for many different reasons. So there are three art historians here where we don't work on the same materials, but we've been able to converge here. And so this is very unusual. And one of the other aspects for me is this difficulty of nationally recognized artists. And this is a subject that Christophe has worked on for a long time. They're recognized nationally, but it's difficult, therefore, to give them international recognition, because the works tend to be in private collections or in national museums. So I'm generalizing here, but that's not just the case for of Balke, but there are very few of these works in non-Norwegian museums. So it's difficult to see those works if you haven't been to Norway. But also it's very difficult for museums to acquire these because they are works which are quite expensive, because they're nationally important artists. And not many of these works go up for sale. So we hope that someday there will be some works in the Petit Palais of Balke. But anyway, but I think we need a Norwegian sponsor to help us with that.
we have the embassy here, don't we? No, I think there is an enthusiasm in Norway, well, entire Scandinavia now, for sharing our art. We have been too much focused on the national scene. I think there is an enthusiasm about sharing our art, which is one of the main missions of the Nordic Institute of Art, to promote historical art from the Nordic region in an international setting like this. So hopefully we will see more of both Mr. Balke and other artists in the future, both here in Paris and Fontainebleau and other places. And I also like to add that, Christophe, you said that the exhibition in New York was a disappointment after London. Of course, it was a much smaller show, but the show here at Fontainebleau is also small, but I must say, Eric, it is very beautiful. It's a beautiful selection, and the composition with Balke, with Biard, and Annette Bergman is brilliant. So you can also experience the work of an artist, small scale, and still get a very good impression, like you can here at Fontainebleau.
Thank you. Peut-être vous avez des questions?
I should have some questions. Is there a microphone?
Okay, I think we have to take that.
Oui, alors je suis Maria
So, Maria Sakkari, I'm the director of Ateum. I'm at the Fine Arts Museum in Helsinki, so I can't help myself to talk about the expedition of Louis Philippe, 1775. He came to Lapland, to Finland, and there are two paintings by François Biard in Versailles that reflect that expedition. In fact, there's a legend, and there are some descendants of Louis Philippe in our country. So he was a very virile person, Louis Philippe. I'm sorry to tell you, but in France, nobody would like to say they were one of Louis Philippe's descendants, apart from his legitimate family, that is. So, anyway, the question of legitimacy is something else. But anyway, it's very interesting because it's in France. There are people who say they're descendants of Napoleon, but not many that say they're descendants of Louis Philippe. I do have a question, more as an art historian. So I think that if I compare Balke with the Finnish artists of the time, there was nobody like him in Finland. And that's surprising, because in Finland, we had some artists that went to Düsseldorf, to Dresden, to paint, like Bernard Holberg. In fact, he also lived in Norway up to his death in 1860. But those artists didn't paint the Finnish landscapes. So I find that quite exceptional, that they painted landscapes in Finland, but it was done very internationally, a bit like Central European artists. So with the Aurora Borealis, this is something which is quite exceptional. It was exceptional to paint it at that time. So how can you explain the Balke's idea to take that as a subject and to use his own subjects from his own country?
That's a big question. How much time do we have? We have the rest of the day, don't we? Well, thank you for your interesting, good to meet you by here today. And in Norway at that time, it was this urge to define the identity, which it also was in Finland. Finland too was a young nation. We have very similarities. Yes. But also to discover Norway, to discover not only the culture, the people, the history, and more than anything else, nature. And of course, Dahl, the great Dahl, he traveled in Norway, but he traveled in the mountains of mid-Norway and to the coast of western Norway, to the dramatic landscape. And there had even been artists before Dahl who had depicted the Norwegian scenery. I think we will talk more about that in the next session, Karl Johan. But no of these artists had ventured to northern Norway. There had been other artists, not Norwegian or Scandinavian art. Well, there had been the Swede Skjøldebrand. He traveled to North Cape in around 1800. Yes, and published this series as a voyage pittoresque. And there was also the German artist Estorff, based in Munich, who lived for a period in Stockholm and traveled to northern Scandinavia, to Iceland, and to Spitsbergen in the Arctic. So there was a certain interest in the Nordic lands, in the northernmost landscapes of Scandinavia, but none of the Norwegian artists had yet taken up that challenge. So I think Balke saw that here was a new field. It was a market, if you like, but there were also new people who had visited that part, and that stimulated his imagination. So off he went, and that became, like for Dahl, it became the mountains and the coast. For Balke, it became the coastal landscape of northern Norway. I think.
That's really interesting, because in Finland we don't have any
No.
artists who would have painted landscapes from northern parts of Finland.
No.
Of course, from Finnish landscape
Mm.
in general, but not.
It's a very interesting comparison, I agree.
D'autres questions?
Question ou intervention?
Merci.
So good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to go back to the issue of Louis Philippe, because it's quite interesting to see that Balke had quite strong political positions, very committed, and but nevertheless he obeyed the orders or the command given by Louis Philippe. So were there any exchanges between countries at that time to see who was doing what, who was who, and if that's the case, why did he obey the king so easily? Well, we don't actually know the political positions of Balke. It's not very clear. We know that in a letter from Johan Christian Dahl, he criticized Balke. He was talking about Balke to somebody else, I can't remember who. He said that Balke was a communist, and that was a problem. Communism at the time was the term was used in its broadest sense at the time, so we don't. But he wasn't part of an international political movement, let's say. So perhaps there was an evolution, but he didn't stay in Paris. He was in Paris in 1847, and things changed. He didn't stay in Paris because if you read the papers of the time, everybody knew that something was happening, something was in the office, and that would have negative consequences for the government. We don't we know that he participated in any of these secret meetings, whether it was in Paris at the time or elsewhere. And perhaps because he didn't speak French well enough. So the title of the exhibition is taken from what Balke said to Louis Philippe, and they talk about savage nudity. So his political positions and what we mentioned with Mr. Knut, though they correspond at a later period of his life. So if we start going into those artists who, during their career, took very strong political positions and responded to commissions. Mr. Knut talked about the conference this morning of Jan Vues. So in terms of the text that was read this morning, we said that Jan Vues made this dialogue and does it like Marianne Goodman. So in those large galleries, the international galleries who produce things for this particular market. So there are always contradictions in that respect. So Richard Wagner also worked for the king of Bavaria. So you can have political commitments, but so the attitude towards Louis Philippe is also a very complex one in France. So there was a revolution. He adopts the tricolor, and he finishes all these major monuments. And he had the column built in the Place de la Bastille. So, but then there were also riots and repression. So that kind of dented his image, if you will. But he was nevertheless supported by intellectuals and people who were quite committed. Even from February 48, things changed. But he did, it seems, have an interest in the rest of the world. So it was a king who, through his expeditions and journeys, and is interested in artists from other countries, and the invitation that from George Catlin to come and work in the Louvre. And what happened with the American Indians, the acquisitions of a number of paintings at the time, show that this is a king that is interested in worldly issues, and also he funded the research for some exhibitions, an exhibition that started in Iceland and Greenland, and then went to the north of Norway, Spitsberg, and around the Northern Cape. So he was very interested in outside events. So we can imagine that if you are a foreign artist and you turn up in Paris and you know that there's a king in power who is interested in external affairs, then you will try and frequent and have access to that king. Perhaps a last question, because then we have to free up the room. I wanted to know if we have any documents on the this part of the city that he built.
Surviving concerning it, but I think also that, and that there are things from his own writings, and there are things regarding the property when he bought it, etc., in the city archives. But I also believe it is a field that needs to be further researched to know even more about.
Thank you.
Yeah.